Welcome to Live Players, where political scientists and strategists Samo, Burja, and I discuss the key individuals with the power to alter our current society. Every week, we provide analysis of the news and case studies of live players as well as key institutions and technologies that make up the global power landscape. Let's dive in. Samo, we're here to talk about Brazil this week. Brazil is a country that people have been saying is on the rise for a long time. It's become kind of a meme that Brazil is up next, so to speak. Why don't you give some historical context for this meme? Why have people been so excited about Brazil, and why is it not panned out? And then we'll talk about the future.
Well, Brazil has been a country of the future and perhaps always will be. People expected the geopolitical fundamentals of a country that today has 200 million people, basically complete resource independence in terms of the proven reserves of everything from energy to minerals. It's a major agricultural producer. At least on paper, it also has this massive river system, right? The Amazon river system is one of the most impressive ones in the world. It's comparable to the Nile River or the Mississippi River system. So in theory, at least, this is a country that should have been able to take off. It has a longer history of interaction with the Western world as well. It has old universities. It has been independent since the 19th century. So really, the theory has been that Brazil is a prime candidate for industrialization. Now I'm going to explain why, to some extent, I think that's not going to happen. Everything said about Brazil's natural bounty is completely true. And it's also the core reason for optimism. The country has huge amounts of fertile arable land. It has a strong agricultural basis. About 6 to 7% of the land is used for agriculture. It has favorable geography, favorable climate. Basically, it's a global exporter of sugar, coffee, tobacco, wood pulp, beef, poultry, soybeans, anything you can think of in a modern agricultural economy, right? And this means that in a way, you could imagine a low population version of Brazil be a little bit like Australia. Australia is a simple resource extraction economy too. They produce a lot of high quality agricultural products. They mine a lot of resources. They export them mostly to China. Global demand for beef and so on, and all of these agricultural fundamentals is going to continue to increase. So if Brazil had 30 million people rather than 200 million people, you could imagine it deploying modern mechanized agriculture and actually leveraging these advantages very strongly. But it's a country of 200 million. And the only way to really make a country like that rich and therefore to some extent powerful is to industrialize it. It has cheap labor, but it's also one of the most dangerous countries in the world, one of the most chaotic countries in the world. The murder rate is very high in Brazil. Like the current Brazilian murder rate is dropping, but it is, I think, comparable to South Africa. In 2022, the homicide rate in Brazil reached 23.3 occurrences per 100,000 inhabitants. For comparison, the US murder rate in the same time period was much, much lower. It was something like 6. So, this is like 4 times the US murder rate. And then in addition to this, there's severe problems with organized crime in the cities. And in addition to this, there's severe corruption problems. Now, Brazil's not a dictatorship, right? And that's a double-edged sword. Brazil is not a dictatorship in the negative sense, that it's not a totalitarian nightmare. There's no single point of failure or corruption or bad or insane policy. But on the other hand, there's no strong driver to reform or pursue the solution to any of these problems that I listed. It is basically suffering from the same problem that a lot of Latin America does, which is they did their best to make a democracy and instead have something that's basically an anarchy, that's kind of a free-for-all. You will have these absurd situations happen in Brazil where you will have an anti-corruption investigation where dozens of politicians are arrested, only for a year later for a judge to throw out most of these charges. And it either happened in the United States, if dozens of congressmen were indicted, right? Or if dozens were pardoned, you would think that this is the beginning of a massive tectonic political shift. And in Brazil, as far as I can tell, what happens is there's a police chief investigator that actually wants to arrest corrupt politicians. And there's a judge that actually wants them to be released. And it's not a preconsidered, premeditated grab for power of anyone. It's not an overturning of norms. It's just a constant high variance clash of interlocking systems where the judicial system, the democratic system, the bureaucratic systems are actually completely discoordinated. And there's no implicit civil service guiding the country in this kind of way that happens often in the English-speaking world. But neither is there potential for true sort of populist, nationalist strongmen to arise. It was never in the cards that President Bolsonaro could have become Brazil's Lee Kuan Yew, or honestly, he couldn't even have been Brazil's Bukele. He couldn't have started rebuilding the bureaucracy of the country because, much like the United States, Brazil is a federal country as well. So the states actually have a significant amount of power. So one pithy way to put it is that Brazil basically took a lot of inspiration from the United States, introduced checks and balances, but all the systems that are supposed to be operating and keeping each other in check, they're just all dysfunctional and all put together incorrectly and all now represent a difficult barrier to building them correctly. There's never been a strong technocratic elite in Brazil. There was an attempt, by the way, to make that happen, which was the capital of Brasilia, was a pretty much planned community where the capital was moved from the older eastern portion of the country where Portuguese colonization first started, where you had these older agricultural based elites and then later also merchant and religious and state elites. And in the 20th century, there was an attempt to create a modern city for a modern country, Brasilia, where you could restart the bureaucratic culture. So this is a move, I think, that is comparable to when Peter the Great moved the capital of the Russian Empire from Moscow to St. Petersburg to try to make Russia a European country, brought in foreign advisors, hired new bureaucrats, basically cut out the old Russian nobility to a great extent. Something very similar was happening here, where in the 60s in Brazil, the view was, okay, we're going to hire new people and they're going to be competent and they're going to be modern in outlook and they will try to modernize the country and they will owe nothing to the plutocratic or oligarchic elites of yesterday. Instead, what happened was that it was just a Washington, D.C., but with, bad urban design. It was designed around the car. It was kind of an unlivable city. It slowly recovered in the last decade or two. It's finally become very desirable to live in Brasilia. But for decades, it was kind of a non-starter, a city deep inside of Brazil in the relatively underdeveloped areas. The problems don't really end there for the country, where even the seemingly abundant resource of cheap labor, we can expect that that advantage that people have been betting on for a long time, that is going to end. Brazil will actually become, as is the case for many third world countries, to everyone's surprise, an old country. The TFR of Brazil today, to get the latest numbers, seems that the latest available are for 2021, but the TFR for Brazil is 1.61. So the total fertility rate is 1.61 children per woman. And this means that the age the average age of Brazilians and the average age of workers is going to rise at a brisk pace. So it's not going to be as rapid as, say, South Korea or China, but they will be facing German-style demographic problems within 30 years without having a German-sized economy. The cost of labor will go up. Urbanization will likely continue because all the young people will basically leave the extended countryside and go into major cities. So one attempt to solve poverty has been basically the colonization, and I do mean this literally, of northern Brazil, basically giving poor people land. In a country that is young and growing, this tends to work. You can have new areas settled. In a country that is old, that is low fertility, I expect all of this migration to the north of Brazil will actually reverse, because in every single country that has aging demographics, we see an emptying of the countryside, with the remaining people concentrating in the cities. This is, say, the pattern in Spain. If you go to a modern Spanish city, you would not think that it's an old country, but the countryside is completely emptied out. This won't negatively impact Brazilian agriculture. Mechanization is still ongoing and developing. In fact, Brazil it's an interesting country because it's one of the few countries where biofuels actually sort of make economic sense, just because they make, so much sugar so cheaply and so much corn, and they already have a ongoing mechanized agricultural sector. So the agricultural sector is not going to be impacted by labor costs, but it means that the lack of a government that can fire entire federal bureaucracies and replace them with new functional ones means that you will continue to have all the bureaucratic boundaries to industrialization, all the problems with trying to do business there, but you won't have the advantage of cheap labor anymore. So you're going to have a large urban population and no industrialization. And that's not going to be a happy scenario in a country that becomes older and older. I think it will get modestly richer the way Latin America will. And at least the murder rate will go down because an old population is a peaceful population. But, Brazil, while it has the advantages of beautiful beaches, there's no way you can have a country of 1 to 200 million people become even moderately prosperous on the back of tourism. Like, that's an option for a country of a few 100,000, right? Like an island nation can maybe sort of do that. Even places like Greece, Italy, and Spain cannot sustain themselves through tourism, actually, at first level living standards. And those are countries of 8 million and 30 million and 55 million, respectively. So with a far deeper cultural and architectural heritage that has global appeal than Brazil's.
That's a good overview. I'm curious to what extent we could have imagined or alternative histories for Brazil over the last decade or two that would have been different, or do you think we made mistakes in hyping up Brazil? Did it have to turn out this way?
I think the mistakes were basically wishful thinking by, I think, Goldman Sachs. I think they coined the term BRICS originally. The term was coined in 2001 by Goldman Sachs economist Jim O'Neill. And I think in 2001, people were hoping for globalization as a rescue for American growth. And the view was that, Russia's about to turn the corner because it's a freshly capitalist country. India, South Africa, Brazil, these are all countries like China and will experience China-like growth. Now, 24 years later, we see only China had this growth, which has been the result of the fact that you actually need a sharp, competent, economic growth-focused government. Even to implement laissez-faire policies, you actually need a live player, right? And you actually need a non-corrupt government. There could be an argument that that's maybe what Milei is trying to achieve in Argentina, but it's telling that Milei could not even achieve an anarcho-capitalist system in Argentina as an entrepreneur. He had to be president, right? So even if he achieves that, and he has suppressed inflation. The view of the economists was that the economic fundamentals of these countries lend themselves so well to industrialization, and the global trade barriers have fallen. There was this view generally that there's a lot of untapped talent in Brazil. This is very much true, by the way. There are even aerospace engineers from Brazil that have moved to other parts of the world and are happily working for Boeing or Airbus right now. There are industries in this country, and there are universities and labs that in theory just have world-class talent. That does happen if you have a country of a few hundred million that sustains education and has some tradition of universities in play. The key mistakes then were thinking that the functionality of government is an afterthought. And they overrated the correct observation that Brazil is a democracy. You know, if you're writing a report in the early 2000s, the fact that China is not a democracy and that Brazil is something of a dysfunctional democracy, it seems like an advantage for Brazil, right? Democracy is supposed to be self-correcting. And I think democracy is not self-correcting. I feel like when you run a democracy, it's sort of like a training run. It's like, you know, you are setting up the system. It is supposed to get certain inputs from the population, but it's not going to connect those inputs on its own. So maybe countries are a little bit like startups in that you have to, if you set up this kind of system, you have to get it right when you found the country. And if not, you maybe have to refound it, right? And you have to just try again until you get all the details of the constitution and the political system and the political economy lined up so that you have enough functionality to like bootstrap you to wealth.
Hey everybody, Erik here with a word from our sponsors. If you don't already subscribe to Turpentine's industry-leading newsletters like our new daily AI newsletter, Emergent Behavior, or Media Empires, you should. But that's not what I'm here to tell you about. The platform we use to power these newsletters is called beehiiv, and it's excellent. First of all, it was started by the same early team who helped build Morning Brew into a $75 million newsletter business. And they built beehiiv to offer that same powerful functionality to anyone sending emails. From essayists to business owners, the platform is beautiful, their text editor is intuitive, and they help you scale your audience with custom growth features. beehiiv has powerful tools to help you monetize your content. You can easily launch paid subscriptions or pursue an advertising model. The beehiiv platform will even connect you to premium brands to sponsor your newsletter. Not only do we use them, but thousands of the top newsletters in the world also use them, like Milk Road, Blockworks, the Lindy newsletter, and so many more. beehiiv's founder hooked up Moment of Zen listeners with a sweet deal. Get 20% off for 3 months with code MOZ. Visit beehiiv.com, that's BEEHIIV.com, to get started. Fast forward to the end of 2024. Think about your goals. What can you do right now to give yourself the best chance of succeeding? If learning a new language is on your list, you absolutely need to check out Babbel. Babbel offers a range of learning tools, self-study app lessons, live classes, and even podcasts, which have always been my favorite way to learn. Studies from Yale, Michigan State University, and others continue to prove Babbel is better. One study found that using Babbel for 15 hours is equivalent to a full semester at college. Babbel isn't just a game to kill time and make you feel like you're learning a language. It's not overly academic or rigid either. It's all about learning language for the real world. Babbel stands out because it's designed by real people using a modern conversational teaching approach. It's not always easy, nothing worth doing ever is, but it's straightforward and designed to help you start speaking in just 3 weeks. With Babbel, I was able to brush up on my intermediate Spanish to ramp up for travel to Argentina last year, and was able to set clear goals based on how much time each week I wanted to practice. Join millions of Babbel language learners across all age groups. Here's a special limited time offer for our listeners. Right now, get up to 60% off your Babbel subscription, but only at babbel.com/Torenberg. That's babbel.com/Torenberg, spelled BABBEL.com/Torenberg. Rules and restrictions may apply.
Once you're wealthy, you can become dysfunctional again, and usually it has to be really bad. The government has to be quite bad for a rich country to become poor again. But if you're poor and you're trying to become rich, you must have a sharp, pragmatic government in place. There's no way around it, because political dysfunction results in everything from nationalization to harassing of companies to just honestly bad policies, incorrect bets, and so on. So the alternative version of Brazil that could have taken off in the early 2000s would not actually have looked good on most metrics. It would have been betting less on commodity globalization and would have been betting more on targeted development of key Brazilian industries. The Brazil in 2001 that had a technocratic economic ministry set up, where they would do something like South Korea's Ministry of Industrialization or Japan's industrial ministries. They would have looked at economic growth projections for China, and they would have identified industry after industry where Brazil could hope to be a Chinese supplier. From 2005 to 2015, it was already baked in that China was going to industrialize in important ways. It was already baked in that eventually Chinese labor costs were going to rise. You could have tried to plug Brazil into the Chinese economy in that way, because the Western economy actually has very little need of Brazil. Most of the components we need are, they're very advanced technological components. We need GPUs from Taiwan, and we maybe need some mineral wealth. We need iron and we need oil, but we get these things from all sorts of other countries around the world. And we don't have a need for Brazilian agricultural products. We actually have our own. We actually have to subsidize. In Europe and the United States, we subsidize agriculture to such a great degree that no foreign competitor can really enter Western markets, right? Even the fact that we buy agricultural produce from Australia is more a fact that the US government was friendly with Australia in the 50s and 60s, and that the European governments were friendly with Australia in the 50s and 60s. I don't think any new country is really allowed to sell food in the Western world without us also giving an equal and opposite handout to our farmers. For a variety of reasons, farmers are bizarrely politically influential and, do successfully lobby for their own benefit. So really, Brazil has nothing to sell us. It could have targeted somewhat on the margin to also sell pork and soy to China, even more aggressively. And the Chinese might have found it slightly more cost efficient to buy it from Brazil than from the United States. But the real approach would have been to say focus on selling car parts to Chinese car manufacturers, or to partnering up with Chinese firms to make the refining of metals happen in Brazil, rather than merely exporting the mineral wealth directly to China to be refined in China. That could have been done with a 10 to 20 year plan with government investment, because there's no rational economic reason for anyone but the Brazilian government to invest in Brazil, and with a strategic overriding of local authorities and overriding of local regulations. So what do I mean here? The Brazilian federal government would have needed to designate a special economic zone and declare that the state government has no business saying what happens there, and also say, and for the next 50 years or 10 years or 20 years, we are going to not enforce our regulation on something like refining metals or car parts. And then you just allow some moderate amount of pollution to happen, and you allow a bunch of people to become very rich, and you plug in, hopefully, into the Chinese supply chain network. And then Brazil of today, of 2025, 2024, would be much more in a position like Vietnam and Indonesia. Still not rich, actually, in a way disappointing, perhaps never quite as rich as Japan or South Korea or Germany or France, but well on the way to development. And instead, Brazil has not, despite its massive economies of scale, right, where Brazil is big enough that it can have big internal markets. So despite the beautiful economies of scale of Brazil, it has not outpaced the economic growth of far smaller countries like Chile or Peru, or all of these very fragmented little jurisdictions where you don't have a big common market. They've not outperformed any of them. So Brazil is big and it has the diseconomies of a dysfunctional government and an elite at war with itself. And it has the diseconomies of politics of scale without the economies of scale for technology and manufacturing and markets, right? Basically, the bigger the market you can have within the same regulatory environment, in a way, the richer a market economy can get. That has always been a big advantage of the United States. That was what the European Union tried to create by trying to create a common market for all those small countries. And that's what China has going for itself when it adopted market reforms. And, in theory, India could achieve something similar. It perhaps will. It has a way better shot of becoming rich than Brazil does. And the reason is it just will have much better demographics than India. And unlike India, it has a foothold in the sort of Asian supply chain. That happened almost as an afterthought in India just because of geographic proximity. Shipping over oceans is cheap, though. Had this been a targeted Brazilian policy, not to bet on BRICS, BRICS is fake. And it's kind of funny that a Goldman Sachs meme was kind of adopted by all of these governments to try to get some of the prestige of Chinese economic growth and pretend, oh, we're just like China, right? Skeptics of the US often talk up BRICS, right? It's sort of like, you could make fun of it. It's sort of I feel like if I follow some otherwise good alternative news sources, there'll be this breathless reporting of like, Sierra Leone has signed a new trade deal with Russia. The US dollar is over. It's like, I feel like I hear a variant of this news all the time, right? That BRICS is about to like replace the Western trade order and so on. And it's just mostly not true. The closest that it's come to being true is Russia leaning on China after the Ukraine war and the sanctions. And the way that this could have been done in Brazil would have required a political revolution. It's just all the candidates who pursue political revolution in Brazil, none of it's positive, right? The likeliest option is some sort of left Marxist style government that basically does not very good economic populism. So I don't think you can ride a communist revolution all the way to Deng Xiaoping. I think when you try to do it, you get something half-baked like Venezuela, or you get something kind of terrifying like Mao. And only decades later, maybe there's a technocratic system that can be put into place. Because by that point, the Communist Party of a country like Vietnam or China is no longer a revolutionary party, but an establishment party, right? So really, there's no ideological current within Brazil that could have produced a strong technocratic pursuit of this kind. One possibility could have been with the very highly accomplished Japanese Brazilian minority. There might have been people there, and there were finance ministers, for example, in Latin American countries who were even educated in Japan, were not just of Japanese ancestry. There might have been enough of a cultural connection and enough of a ability to recruit experts straight out of Japan to intentionally recreate the sort of industrial and trade policy that you see there, right? Like you have this ministry in Japan that is called the Ministry of International Trade and Industry. International trade and industry, where it's not trying to plan an economy, it's just trying to plan the competitiveness of Japanese firms holistically in an international context. That was sort of the way that East Asia industrialized. And regardless of some disadvantages Brazil has, it could have accomplished that to at least the level of Vietnam and Indonesia. And I think now they never will, unless there was a understanding within Brazil that, no, wait, our problem is the lack of a unified, coherent push. Our problem is not that we lack democracy and we need democracy to beat oligarchy or something like that. Our problem is not that the rich people are selling us out to the United States. That's also not a problem. The problem is There's no one with the power to fire all bureaucrats and hire a new bureaucracy. And ideologically, that's not even in the discourse space within anywhere in Latin America. I guess Bukele maybe comes close to that. And even he's not trying to build new technocratic ministries. He's just trying to solve problems like crime and so on. And then, Argentina arguably has a more mature civil service. Their Milei is sort of, I think, just trying to do like a double Thatcher, let's call it, like the same kind of reforms that Thatcher implemented in Britain to try to break out some economic growth. I think he's just trying to do that again. And I think that'll work, but it won't work well enough to make Argentina rich. And Argentina has better fundamentals. It's a fundamentally more unified country than Brazil is. Argentina is what? It's Buenos Aires plus some farms, right? There's like a single city in a way that dominates it. And Brazil has different regions with competing interests and clashing cultures. So one way to summarize it is Brazil is an empire without an emperor, right? It should have been like 5 or 6 different countries, or it needed about 100 years of strong central government to really make it a coherent unit. So that is like one of the deeper historical things that would have needed to be overcome in the 20th century. And I think it would have taken inspired leadership, like at least Lee Kuan Yew level leadership, to have been able to successfully do that.
Hey everybody, Erik here with a word from our sponsors. The tech world turns to the Brave browser for its unbeatable privacy protections. But did you know that Brave also has a private ad platform? Brave Ads offers first-party targeting, and it's been cookieless since day one, so you can relax while third-party tracking cookies disappear from the web. Today, millions of people turn to ad blockers to avoid being tracked and pestered online. But Brave's new ad model aligns incentives for users and advertisers. Users earn rewards for viewing ads, which they can save, spend, or pass along to their favorite creators. And advertisers score points for respecting user privacy, generating ROI without invasive tracking. So whether it's high-impact announcements on the new tab page or keyword-targeted ads in Brave Search offers diverse, private, future-proof ad formats for all your business goals. Join the future of advertising at brave.com/ads. Mention Turpentine to get 25% off your first campaign.
Let's say a leader in Brazil was listening to you, or a set of leaders, and came up to you and said, "Hey, Samo, we want your advice. If you could help, if we could wave a wand and make any changes that you think should happen here and need to happen, what would your proposed plan be?"
I mean, I think my proposed plan would be just basically focus on a sharp diagnosis and a sharp, concrete imitation of the East Asian model of industrialization. The labor costs will never be as favorable as they were 10 or 20 or 30 years ago, but it's better late than never. So attempt to do something similar to what has been shown to somewhat almost work in Britain, which is cultivate a small intelligentsia cadre that studies and basically copies what Japan and South Korea and Taiwan did on the government level, so not the private sector level, the government level. Pair this with basically a populist president that is capable of understanding the argument of a smaller technocratic clique. Put them into a political party that has actual party discipline. So that is a party where the structure is very focused into a small number of players who can kick out members out of that political party for, not complying with the official party doctrine. So like, Lenin would have called this democratic centralism. I wouldn't call this a revolutionary party at all. I called it populist, because then it should appeal to the economic self-interest and the cultural self-interest and a desire to make Brazil great. Right? A desire to achieve the national motto, which is order and progress. Win a few elections, govern for 10 years, set up that ministry, set up, a special economic zone is already difficult because I think that would require way more than can be done with the federal system, but even a sharp trade policy. And then internationally, remain friendly to the United States or even become friendlier to the United States, but understand that the US will not have your back economically. If you will pursue a trade policy, you should expect clashes with both the European Union and the United States. And the best way to try to balance that is an orientation where you economically try to play off the Chinese economic bloc, which is mostly China, but to some extent now Russia, versus the Western economic bloc, which has its own friction between the EU and the United States. Because while people speak of free trade is kind of already over. Like we're talking about 100% tariffs on Chinese electric vehicles in the US, or, the European Commission is finding new and exciting ways to ban and regulate American tech companies in Europe. This is protectionism, right? It's happening already. But I think that the goal here should be small group of actually excellent, well-trained academics who are not Marxists, but are not just free trade guys. They have to be something nuanced and weird, studying the Japanese and South Korean model, and then paired up with the first real political party in Brazil in decades, where by real, I mean the party has an explicit and coherent program that's not a grab bag of things that happen to be popular with the Brazilian equivalent of baby boomers, right? That just are regurgitating the national philosophy, but it has a coherent development program. And then a relatively charismatic presidential candidate, not because you can fix the whole Brazilian federal government. It is as entrenched as the US federal government. The components just work way worse. But instead to just create this one functional ministry. And that should just be the one mission of the Brazilian president for ideally many years, for up to a decade. And if after that you lose the election or the party splinters, that's fine. But that I would see is the MVP for reforming Brazil.
Are there lessons that you think other countries, whether it's in Latin America or more broadly, are also struggling with, or lessons that they should learn from what's happened in Brazil, that they may face a similar fate?
I think you cannot imitate the form of Western governments. You have to imitate the functionality of Western governments. Look, Latin America is basically part of the extended Western world. We just don't like calling it part of the Western world because it's dysfunctional. What do I mean by that? It was, I've not heard many people argue that Spain and Portugal are not Western countries. I've heard many people argue that all former British colonies are Western countries. They had the same traditions of Enlightenment philosophy, and a lot of the same stuff derived from Christianity and Catholicism that you see in the English-speaking colonies around the world, the settler colonies such as Canada or the United States or Australia or New Zealand. And they were intellectually following the same currents in the 20th century. So they had sort of access to the same sort of intellectual currents that you might have influenced East Asian thinkers, right? Thinkers in Japan or South Korea or, other US Asian allies during the Cold War. I think they over-focused on imitating the mature state of Western countries, both at their founding in the 1800s. They were trying to make a constitution like that of the United States, but with a really different culture. There was no tradition like in England of, Puritan colonists doing self-governing experiments. There was no deep constitutional tradition in Spain that they could have derived from, such as existed in Britain, right? Like today, I think people forget how much of the procedural knowledge of how to run an American republic was basically people, being literal Englishmen who had seen English Parliament work. Thomas Paine is a great example, right? Trying to implement just the government without the full social technology stack was a mistake. But circumstances have changed so much that it's too late to try to make the 18th century dream real, because the 18th century dream already moved for a more technocratic, bureaucratic, also market-driven approach. Bureaucracies and markets actually work together beautifully when they're functional. So you have to find a unique path to modernization. And again, imitating China is not going to do either. Trying to do like a Maoist movement now in the hope that you have Deng later, that's not going to work either. You're much, much likelier to end up being, if you do that, Zimbabwe or Venezuela, than you are to end up being China. And the moment of decolonialization is also over, right? What was the moment of decolonialization? It is a founding moment when you have a new country. There's no country in the world that was a colony 5 years ago, but is now no longer a colony. In many of these places, the dysfunctional patterns post-independence are entrenched. You can't pull a Singapore unless you used to be a British colony yesterday. So there are few places to have the advantage of being a new country. Brazil is an old country. It has been independent almost as long as the United States has been independent. It has set ways of doing things. But honestly, even African countries are old countries at this point, right? Like Mali has been Mali for decades. South Africa has been South Africa for a century with regime changes. Kenya has been Kenya for half a century. I think that there has to be a willingness to radically revise the national traditional way of doing things. Someone should be in Brazil should say, we have spent 200 years imitating the Western world. We should actually stop that. We should stop doing that. And we should find our own path to the future. And I think many other countries need to do this, because the countries that were about to successfully imitate the Western world, they have kind of one chance to do that, right? When there's a new country, if you're very good at what you do, and which I think did happen in Poland or Estonia, and you implement the system well, then you can actually just follow the Western model. I predict Estonia and Poland are just going to be normal, functional, Western, rich democracies. That's just going to work for them. But had they messed it up at founding, which honestly, I sort of think Serbia's founding is kind of messed up. Ukraine's being refounded through the war, so maybe it'll save itself. Romania was kind of messed up immediately post end of communism, and that's not going to be resolved. And there's no way to resolve it by imitating even harder, right? Like either it was a successful copy of the social technology stack when you implement a new balance of power, or it wasn't. And if it wasn't, you must create a new and different solution. So there.
What other countries do you think should not imitate the West? And I guess, and what are even the options? Like, if you're looking at the menu of like, what would it mean for them to find their own path?
Well, I think that, let's say in Africa, right? I think Africa's promising because it has a very young population. I think that it is still possible that big dysfunctional African countries could break down into smaller ones. And honestly, the same could happen in Brazil. And in that situation, if you're starting afresh, you could actually try to set up a Western style government right off the ground. But it would still require, I don't know, 50 to 500 people who are well educated, non-corrupt, idealistic, somewhat patriotic. So you need like a Supreme Court that's not corrupt. You need like someone to write the Constitution. You need some people who are competent ministers. And you need them to be in the same political party. And they need to basically agree as to how this whole balance of power that you're setting up in a country is run. Like a well-run government is no less complex than a nuclear power plant, actually, right? So either the pieces fit or they don't. And if you try to build a more complicated machine, like a modern bureaucratic state, it just gets harder. In many ways, Bukele is smart because Bukele is not trying to recreate a Western-style government. He's building a way simpler machine. He's just building a presidential dictatorship with some oversight from the population and some that focuses on acquiring peace and growth first. and then leaving these more tricky problems of what you do after Bukele for later. So around the world, they might focus on finding simpler solutions first, where simpler being in this just get one or two parts of government right and don't bother building the other parts, right? And I think the trickiest ones to get right are a functioning executive that has bureaucrats that listen to an executive, and the other one is a predictable judicial branch. So I think, Honduras is doing pretty well right now, even though it just has the first, but not the second. One day it might have the second too. And I think that many countries around the world should focus getting functional executive in first, because what does a functional executive do? It can get you from the world of unpredictable corruption, where bribes are taken for big projects, but bribes might not be respected even for big projects, right? You might be like, oh yes, please come build a port in my country. And then you're like, I built this. This is my port now, right? I'm nationalizing it, even though you gave me a big payoff when we were negotiating whether you can build a big port in my country. I'm just now stealing it anyway. So you can get to that point. You can go from disorganized corruption to organized corruption. And then the judicial one hopefully brings you to the point where the organized corruption is no longer corruption, but just a predictable business and social environment. So I think many more countries should focus on the first and then get the second. And I think that there are a few places that I would emphasize have done this. I think Paul Kagame sort of understands that even if you want to build a democracy in Rwanda, you can't just institute, like if you try to institute a Western style constitution to overcome the ethnic hatreds and lack of development in a country like Rwanda, the outcome is not going to be Singapore. The outcome is going to be Bosnia, right? Where this has this terrible federal system, completely gridlocked, 4 police forces, different official languages, just a complete mess. It's much better to do something like basically have a national reconciliation and to a great extent just have a central unitary government override the ethnic hatreds rather than to try to balance the interests immediately into some sort of federal system. So I think around the world, I would say that a central government that has the aim to make a country rich through dealing with both Western and Chinese corporations, however you ideologically justify that, but it has to be a hard-headed sort of executive, right? It has to be an executive that does not assume that they will automatically get a fair deal just because this is free trade or something like this. It has to be sort of looking at to which preconditions of an industrial economy are you pursuing or not. And I think that's honestly, it's a missing ideology. I don't know where it's going to come from, but I think that I would be modestly optimistic that in countries such as India, maybe Nigeria, that are tied to Anglosphere intellectual currents, there will be people who are interested in the formation of small functional bureaucracies, and that there could be governments that are strong enough to build at least a few working components of government before you try to balance it to have it work in the long run. Sort of get rich first, worry about democracy second. There are many ways to do this incorrectly, but clearly something like this worked in East Asia, not just for China, which maybe never will be a democracy, but it definitely worked for South Korea, for Taiwan, Singapore, and arguably Japan.
That makes a lot of sense. Is there anything about Brazil that we've not yet covered that you think we should cover?
I think that Brazil could be a superpower of the Southern Hemisphere if with the right institutions. And especially if the US were to enter decline at some point, Brazil could be a major power. Geopolitically, it is the likeliest of all Latin American countries to become powerful. It has these geographical advantages. But I think that it shouldn't be underestimated to what an extent there is a linguistic advantage it has as well. Brazil could have its own startup and technology ecosystem because it has 200 million users, right? It's not China scale, it's not America scale, but it means that even a few years ago, the most popular social media network in Brazil was not Facebook, right? I may forget what it was called, but for a while, Facebook was not the top social media company in Brazil, as was the case in many other countries around the world. It was a Brazilian company. And I think that's interesting, right? It's not going to be enough to make a country rich. India, I think, demonstrates this. India has now an ever more vibrant IT sector, but it's not enough to make a billion people rich. It is, however, something that can cultivate and retain talent in the country and also possibly produce economic elites, economically literate elites that are interested in reforming the country towards prosperity. So in the case of Brazil, Nigeria, and India, I could see technology wealth producing and cultivating enough talent in the countries themselves to give basically the intelligence and the money for a national reform and industrialization political movement. So that's one thing about Brazil where I think actually the language barrier is a natural subsidy and it has its own graph, and you could have a totally different digital consumer economy serving them, similar to how VKontakte and Yandex serves the Russian one, or how the Chinese ecosystem is kind of locked in.
One other question before we close. Can you sort of compare Brazil's situation to the rest of Latin America? Is it an outlier? Do they face some of the similar problems? Why don't you just make that contrast a little bit high level?
I think at the highest level, Brazil has similar problems to many of these small and unstable Latin American would-be presidential democracies, where they have this kind of very anarchic government where the pieces are not very functional and almost the political parties are very insubstantial and they're not coherent. So it's a little bit of a constant political storm. They have constant political churn. But unlike a lot of the smaller Latin American countries, Brazil is truly huge. Only could be compared to Mexico, right? Mexico is the only country that probably has a government that would be as difficult to make functional because it's a comparable scale. So it has the political diseconomies of scale with its various regions being truly very different. And in fact, if you replaced Brazil with 10 independent countries, I think odds are pretty good that one or two of those countries would end up being quite prosperous. But that's unlikely to happen. There's very little political energy for that. And if there was political energy for that, that seems like a recipe for civil war. The only way out for Brazil is through. Meanwhile, in places like Argentina, in places like El Salvador, these are small enough and unified enough that the political tempest can sometimes just resolve itself into a single politician with a very good set of ideas, and they could solve it. Wouldn't even require a full-on political party, honestly. But I think for Brazil, that is required because you must have support in basically all the parts of the existing Brazilian system. And that's not something that a single person can do. That requires hundreds, if not thousands.
Maybe we can wrap this episode with a quick sort of summary of kind of like the bull case and the bear case for Brazil as we see it going forward.
The bull case for Brazil is that once it becomes peaceful, it becomes fashionable to visit. And once it becomes fashionable to visit, there's interest in investment. And that the slowly over the course of becoming, just a boring, kind of not very dangerous country, the corruption issue is worked out through the normal operating of the judiciary. And then Brazil sees modest growth and all of Latin America sees modest growth. And eventually they sort of become like Greece, not super rich, but not quite third world in the way we think of as the third world. and the quality of life is relatively high, though the future is uncertain and people are still leaving the region and still leaving the country for, better and more prosperous economies like the United States, Canada, maybe even the EU, maybe one day even China, honestly. That's the bull case. And now the bear case is that these countries will truly be profoundly impoverished and perhaps even depopulated once they are old. So basically, it could enter a very bad death spiral where there are many, many old people. They're all the voters. All the voters say we should extract more from the young for the old. And there's really no economic engine to get them out of that tailspin. Like, how exactly are you going to overcome Brazilian voters to implement a youthful revolution if, say, the average age of Brazil was 50 or 60, but it wasn't much richer than it is right now? I think the old voters would just vote themselves pensions until hyperinflation kicks in. And no politician would stand against that. And then hyperinflation would kick in and would stay there. And all the young people would do their best to leave, first for the big cities and then from the big cities elsewhere. And you might end up with, I don't know, maybe the Brazilian rainforest reclaims large chunks of previously settled land. Maybe environmentalists like this outcome, but I'm sure Brazilian nationalists and patriots would not like that outcome.
I think it's a great place to wrap this this overview of Brazil. Look forward to doing many more live player analyses. Samo, thanks so much, and until next time.
Till next time.
Thanks for listening to Live Players. Please subscribe, leave a review, and check out Samo's excellent newsletter, The Bismarck Brief, for more rigorous analysis of key individuals, institutions, or industries. Live Players is a production of Turpentine, the podcast network behind Econ 102 with Noah Smith and Moment of Zen.